The glittering lights of the Santiago Bernabéu, the thunderous, shaking roars of Old Trafford, and the clinical perfection of 5 Ballon d'Or trophies do not belong to the world Cristiano Ronaldo was born into. To truly understand the psychological fortress that modern defenders and managers have spent more than 2 decades trying to breach, you have to leave the modern luxury of European football behind and look at a map of the Atlantic Ocean, independent of continental wealth. You have to travel to Santo Antonio, a mountainside neighborhood in Funchal on the isolated Portuguese island of Madeira. It was here, in a small, tin-roofed home where the wind from the cold ocean rattled the window panes every single night, that a boy named Cristiano Ronaldo dos Santos Aveiro was born in 1985. He was an unplanned child, a 4th sibling in a family where money was not a resource but a daily calculation, and where basic survival was prioritized over any grand artistic ambition. His mother, Maria Dolores, worked long hours as a cook and a cleaning woman, while his father, Dennis, was a municipal gardener who carried the heavy, quiet trauma of a war veteran who had served in Portugal's grueling colonial conflicts in Africa. It was an environment of extreme scarcity, but inside that small house, an obsession was quietly taking root. Ronaldo did not look at the steep, rocky streets of Funchal and see a limitation. He saw a laboratory. By the time he was 7 years old, he didn't just play football. He lived in a state of permanent internal competition with the world around him. While other children were enjoying the typical structure of a childhood, Ronaldo was playing on the asphalt, dodging cars, and treating every uneven stone as a tactical obstacle to be overcome. He had a scrawny frame, a head of wild, curly hair, and an emotional volatility that his peers quickly noticed. They called him Crybaby because the moment a teammate failed to pass him the ball, or the second shot drifted wide of the makeshift goalposts made of old jackets, tears would stream down his face. But those tears were not a sign of weakness. They were the first liquid drops of an intense, competitive fire that would eventually burn through every defensive structure in Europe. His first formal step into organized football occurred at CF Andorinha, a small, local club where his father worked part-time as the equipment manager. It was a humble setting, a club operating under tight financial constraints, but it provided Ronaldo with his first real platform. At Andorinha, the coaches didn't need data or complex analytics to realize they were witnessing something completely anomalous. Even against older boys, the 7-year-old Ronaldo possessed a level of spatial awareness and ball control that felt entirely detached from his age. He didn't just want to win the match, he wanted to possess the match entirely. If his team was losing, he would take the ball from his own goalkeeper, navigate through the entire opposition lineup, and strike the ball with a level of ferocity that left onlookers completely silent. He was processing the game at a different frame rate than everyone else on the pitch, translating his internal frustration into a clinical display of technical superiority. But as his reputation began to spread across the island, moving from Andorinha to the larger local club, Nacional, a much larger and more terrifying realization began to form in the minds of his family. Madeira was becoming too small for his ambition. The island that had shaped his physical resilience was now a cage, and to fulfill a destiny that felt increasingly inevitable, the 12-year-old boy would have to make a choice that would break his mother's heart and alter his life forever. He would have to pack a single suitcase, leave the security of his family behind, and board a plane to the mainland to face the brutal, unforgiving Academy of Sporting Lisbon, a place where no one cared about his island roots and where his accent would make him a target for ridicule from day one. And as that plane lifted off from the runway in Funchal, leaving the tin-roofed house in shadows of the mountains, the scrawny boy looked out the window, completely unaware that he had just initiated the first chapter of a tactical blueprint that would eventually conquer the world, starting with a trial that would shock the scouts in Lisbon. The transition from the volcanic, isolated slopes of Madeira to the crushing, urban reality of Lisbon was not a step up a footballing ladder. It was a violent drop into a treading water survival pool. When a 12-year-old Cristiano Ronaldo stepped off the plane at the capital's airport in 1997, he didn't bring an entourage, a brand consultant, or a digital marketing strategy. He brought a solitary cardboard suitcase, a thick, heavy island accent that mainlanders could barely decipher, and an inner world entirely built on a singular, unyielding promise made to his mother that he would either conquer this game or die trying. But inside the concrete walls of Sporting Lisbon's famous youth academy, the Metropolitan boys did look at this new recruit and see a future king. They saw a provincial anomaly, an easy target for their daily entertainment. They mocked his dialect, openly laughed at his skeletal, scrawny frame, and treated his explosive emotional outbursts as definitive proof that he lacked the psychological equilibrium required to survive at the highest level of Portuguese football. For a young child living hundreds of miles away from the security of his family, the capital was not a dreamland. It was a cold, institutional cage. He spent his first few months crying himself to sleep on a narrow mattress, dropping coins into public payphones on the street corner while begging his mother to let him abandon the trial and return to the safety of Funchal. But behind those tears, a terrifying psychological mechanism was beginning to lock itself into place. Ronaldo realized very early in his Lisbon residency that natural talent was an incredibly cheap commodity in the capital. Every single child walking through the doors of Sporting could handle football with elegant ease. If he was going to survive the club's relentless sorting system, he would have to develop a work ethic that bordered on the psychopathic. While the other academy kids were sleeping or sneaking out of their dormitories to explore the nightlife of Lisbon, Ronaldo was quietly picking the locks of the academy gymnasium at 2 a.m. He would train in total darkness, lifting weights, performing endless sets of sit-ups, and running explosive sprints until his lungs felt like they were going to burst. When the academy medical staff explicitly warned him that he was far too skinny to ever make it as a professional center forward, he didn't argue with their data. Instead, he sneaked out to the concrete pitches with heavy weights strapped to his ankles, practicing his step-overs in the freezing night air until his movements adapted to the extreme physical resistance. He was systematically converting his isolation into raw, focused kinetic force, treating every mockery from the mainland boys as a ledger of debt that would eventually be collected on the pitch. By the time he turned 16, the scrawny kid from Madeira had effectively broken the club's development pipeline through sheer volume of production. In a single, breathless campaign during the 2002-2003 season, Ronaldo became the first player in the entire history of Sporting Lisbon to play for the under-16, under-17, under-18, the B team, and the senior first team all within a 12-month window. When he made his official first-team debut against Moreirense, scoring 2 brilliant goals with a display of raw, arrogant verticality, the stadium suddenly realized they weren't just watching a normal winger prospect, they were watching an evolutionary leap in the sport. He played with a theatrical audacity that was deeply infuriating to veteran defenders. He would intentionally halt his run, bait his marker with the ball, perform 5 lightning-fast step-overs in a row, and accelerate past them with a level of speed that looked completely artificial on the broadcast tape. He was no longer the weak crybaby from Andorinha. He was a teenage phenomenon who had completely weaponized his personal trauma, transforming his fragile childhood psychology into an armor of absolute, uncompromising self-belief that shielded him from the pressures of the big stage. Yet, as the global scouting networks began to turn their lenses toward Lisbon, calculating the immense financial and tactical value of a teenager who was tearing apart the Primeira Liga, a much larger stage was preparing to present itself. Ronaldo had outgrown the mainland just as he had outgrown the island, and his performance was about to catch the attention of the single most influential manager in the history of British football. The local Portuguese papers were calling him a rising star, but a friendly pre-season match against a visiting English giant in August 2003 was about to turn his life into a global obsession, leading to a legendary locker room confrontation that would completely shatter the traditional transfer market structure forever. And as the Manchester United team bus rolled into Lisbon for that fateful exhibition game, the young winger stood quietly in the concrete tunnel, looking at the icons of the Premier League, completely aware that this was the exact 90-minute window he had spent his entire life training for in the dark. But nobody could have predicted just how quickly a single conversation on a plane back to England would alter the path of his career forever. The date is August 6, 2003. It was supposed to be a standard, low-stakes pre-season friendly designed to inaugurate Sporting Lisbon's brand-new stadium. The Manchester United squad, heavy-legged from an exhausting summer tour and filled with established global icons, looked at the match as a mandatory fitness exercise before returning to the grueling reality of the English season. But inside the home dressing room, an 18-year-old Cristiano Ronaldo looked at the team sheet and saw his entire life narrowed down to a single 90-minute window. He was handed the starting spot on the left wing, directly opposing United's veteran defender John O'Shea. From the opening whistle, what unfolded was not a standard football match. It was a public breakdown of a world-class defensive system. Every time Ronaldo touched the ball, he exploded. He executed step-overs at a velocity that looked entirely glitch-like, leaving multi-million-pound defenders completely stuck to the grass, unable to track his change of direction. He was playing with an arrogant, joyous verticality that made the United players look like they were moving through water. Legend has it that at halftime, a completely exhausted John O'Shea joke appealed to the medical staff for an oxygen mask, dizzy from chasing a teenager who refused to stop. In the dressing room after the match, the Manchester United players weren't discussing tactical adjustments or travel schedules. They were talking about the kid with the wild hair. Multi-titled veterans told Sir Alex Ferguson plainly that they could not leave Lisbon without securing this boy's signature. Ferguson, a man who had spent decades scouting the finest talent in the world, didn't need to be convinced. He had watched the teenage winger manipulate the space on the pitch with a level of cognitive speed that defied his age. Ferguson delayed the team charter plane, remaining in the stadium offices until a £12.5 million transfer fee was formally agreed upon. Within days, the scrawny teenager was standing inside Old Trafford, holding a red jersey. He expected to wear the number 28, the number he wore in Lisbon, but Ferguson had a different plan. He handed him the legendary number 7 shirt, the shirt worn by George Best, Eric Cantona, and David Beckham. It was a massive psychological burden designed to break most young players, but Ferguson knew that Ronaldo's internal engine was the only mechanism capable of carrying that historic weight. The transition to English football, however, was a brutal physical and cultural shock. The Premier League in the early 2000s was a physical war zone, a league where veteran defenders treated showboating as a personal insult. In his first few months, Ronaldo's theatrical style made him an immediate target for opposition center-backs. He would perform 6 step-overs in his own half, lose possession, and go down looking for a foul, only to be told to get back up by the referee. The fans grew frustrated with his lack of end product, calling him a one-trick pony who preferred the spectacle over the goal. But this is where the genius of Sir Alex Ferguson altered the trajectory of football history. Ferguson didn't try to strip away Ronaldo's natural flair. He protected it while brutally correcting his efficiency. He allowed the veteran players in training to tackle Ronaldo with full force, forcing the young Portuguese winger to understand that if he wanted to survive, his body had to adapt to a level of resistance that his peers couldn't even conceptualize. Ferguson became the father figure Ronaldo needed, providing the emotional security to channel his erratic obsession into a structured, lethal weapon. Under Ferguson's strict tutela, the transformation was spectacular. The young boy who used to cry when a pass went astray was slowly being replaced by a calculated, cold-blooded machine. He was learning to use his speed not just to embarrass his marker, but to break the defensive line at the exact moment the midfield was ready to deliver the pass. By the end of his 3rd season in Manchester, the tricks were becoming goals, and the boy from the island was beginning to understand how to control the tempo of a match. But as the 2006 World Cup approached, a controversial international incident with a club teammate would push his relationship with the English public to a dangerous breaking point, threatening to destroy everything he had built at Old Trafford before he even reached his prime. The summer of 2006 was supposed to be the grand stage where Cristiano Ronaldo announced his tactical genius to the international community, but instead it mutated into a brutal, unforgiving baptism of fire that nearly destroyed his entire career in English football before he even had a chance to reach his true prime. During a high-stakes, maximum-tension World Cup quarter-final match between Portugal and England, his Manchester United club teammate Wayne Rooney was shown a straight red card following a fierce, physical challenge on Ricardo Carvalho. Ronaldo had aggressively sprinted across the pitch to appeal to the referee for the booking, and as a frustrated Rooney walked toward the tunnel, the television cameras caught Ronaldo delivering a subtle, highly calculated wink toward the Portuguese bench. It was a moment of pure competitive pragmatism, an instinctive reaction from a boy who had learned on the dust-filled streets of Funchal that you do whatever it takes to survive, but back in the hyper-reactive landscape of United Kingdom, it was treated as an act of ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. The British media launched an immediate, unprecedented campaign of psychological hostility against him, branding the young winger as a calculated villain, a manipulative traitor, and a modern football fugitive who could no longer walk safely down an English street. When the Premier League campaign returned that August, the atmosphere inside every domestic stadium was toxic. Every single touch Ronaldo took on the ball was met with a deafening wall of hostile boos, venomous insults, and systematic whistling from 40,000 fans who wanted nothing more than to watch the young Portuguese star break completely under the immense weight of public hatred. But this is the exact moment where our archive shifts away from a standard narrative of a young victim and transitions into the cinematic blueprint of an apex predator. Ronaldo did not run away from the public hatred. He did not look for a transfer to a quieter league, despite his agent actively exploring options in Spain. Instead, he absorbed the hostility of the crowd, internalized the structural anger of an entire nation, and converted that negative emotional energy into raw, kinetic power inside a laboratory of human engineering. He returned to Manchester United's Carrington training ground that summer looking like an entirely different human being. The scrawny, lightweight, and fragile winger from the island of Madeira had vanished entirely over the course of a single off-season, replaced by a powerfully built, hyper-muscled powerhouse who'd spent his entire vacation deadlifting, fortifying his core, and maximizing his muscle mass to ensure his body could withstand the brutal, bone-crunching challenges of English defenders. He realized that if the football world was going to give him no peace, he would give them absolutely no mercy. He systematically altered his daily routine, turning his life into a cold, mechanical process of optimization where sleep, nutrition, and physical conditioning were measured down to the millimeter. The boy who used to rely on fragile emotional states was engineering an indestructible physical armor designed to take hit after hit without ever dropping his speed or sacrificing his balance. Under the strict visionary guidance of tactical coach René Meulenstein and the protective, parental shield of Sir Alex Ferguson, Ronaldo began the process of stripping away the unnecessary, decorative elements from his tic-tac style. Meulenstein famously set the young winger down in a film room, showing him hours of tape to prove a single, numbers-driven point. His endless, theatrical step-overs on the periphery of the pitch were making him predictable and lowering his statistical efficiency. The coaches demanded a total mental calibration. Ronaldo needed to stop trying to score the most beautiful goal on the pitch and start trying to become the most lethal entity in the final third. The transformation was immediate and devastating. The boy who used to play for the applause of the crowd was now playing for the cold reality of the scoreboard. His movements became more direct, explosive, and hyper-efficient, trading the wide spaces of the touchline for devastating, vertical attacking lines that sliced through the heart of opposition defenses. He was no longer just an eccentric trickster. He was evolving into a transitional monster, a hybrid forward who could out-sprint a fullback while out-muscling a veteran center back in the air. As the boos grew louder in every stadium from London to Newcastle, his statistical output began to expand exponentially, creating a fascinating contrast between the hatred in the stands and the absolute dominance on the pitch. Defenders who used to treat him as a lightweight showboat were now finding themselves physically overwhelmed by a player who could accelerate at 21 miles per hour while carrying enough upper body mass to shrug off a sliding tackle. By the time the exhausting 2006 to 2007 campaign reached its conclusion, Ronaldo had completely broken the spirit of his critics, dragging Manchester United back to the absolute summit of English football to claim his very first Premier League title while completely sweeping the Individual Player of the Year awards. He had successfully turned the most hostile environments in England into his personal theaters of validation, proving to the world that his self-belief was an unbreakable substance. But this domestic triumph was merely the opening movement of a much grander, more terrifying symphony of dominance, because as the calendar turned toward the historic winter of 2007, Ronaldo was about to push his physical engineering to a level that would completely redefine the global goal-scoring standards for a modern winger, setting up a wet, dramatic night in a freezing Eastern European capital that would test the absolute limits of his psychological threshold. By the autumn of 2007, the hostile whistles that had once echoed across the stadium terraces of England had completely transformed into a collective gasp of disbelief. The Premier Division of English football was no longer a balanced competitive landscape. It had mutated into an environment entirely dictated by the physical and technical parameters of one man. The 2007 to 2008 season became the definitive gallery for Cristiano Ronaldo's peak evolution under the paternal guidance of Sir Alex Ferguson. He was no longer just a traditional winger operating on the structural periphery of the pitch. He had successfully converted himself into a terrifying, predatory force that lived inside the tactical half-spaces and the penalty box, shifting the competitive equilibrium of Manchester United completely. Every single statistical metric used to evaluate a modern forward was utterly shattered. He wasn't just scoring goals, he was scoring goals that felt like absolute expressions of physical and psychological superiority. He would strike free kicks with a brand new, unpredictable knuckleball technique that made the ball change direction violently in midair, leaving world-class goalkeepers completely stationary, unable to calculate the mathematical trajectory of the ball. The numbers were no longer human: 42 goals in 49 appearances across all competitions. For a winger operating in the most physically punishing league on the planet, those numbers weren't just a career high, they were an institutional shock to the system that announced a new era. Every numbers-driven analysis of that historic Manchester United squad revealed a terrifying reality for the rest of Europe. Ronaldo had completely automated the process of winning football matches. But the true, definitive test of his newly engineered psychology was not going to take place in the comfortable routine of domestic league football. It was waiting for him on a freezing, rain-soaked night in Moscow on May 21st, 2008, inside the historic Luzhniki Stadium, where the ultimate European prize was on the line against domestic rivals Chelsea. This was the exact historical climax the 23-year-old had spent his entire life working toward in the dark rooms of Lisbon and Funchal. In the 26th minute of the match, the entire world witnessed the perfect marriage of his physical evolution and his elite spatial intelligence. As Wes Brown floated a high, delicate cross into the box, Ronaldo suspended himself in the air, seemingly defying gravity for a fraction of a second longer than humanly possible, towering over Chelsea's defensive line to smash a thunderous header into the back of the net. It was a goal born out of pure athletic dominance, a moment that felt like the definitive coronation of a global king. But football is a game of brutal narrative shifts, and the path to immortality is rarely linear. As the match stretched into a tense, agonizing penalty shootout after a grueling 1-1 draw, Ronaldo stepped up to take United's third spot kick. He performed his trademark stutter step, a psychological bait designed to freeze Petr Cech, but the veteran goalkeeper refused to dive early, lunging brilliantly to his right to push Ronaldo's strike away from the target. In an instant, the universe fell silent for the young Portuguese star. The man who had carried the entire weight of the club on his back all season was suddenly staring into the abyss of ultimate failure. He stood on the halfway line, his chest heaving, his face covered in rain, forced to watch his teammates decide his operational destiny. If John Terry converted his final penalty, the dream was dead, and Ronaldo's missed strike would become the defining image of his career, a historical scar that no amount of domestic titles could ever erase. But just as the tension reached an unbearable breaking point, the wet Moscow turf intervened, causing Terry to slip and send a shot against the post, opening the door for Edwin van der Sar to eventually block Nicolas Anelka's final effort. The moment the ball was saved, Ronaldo didn't join the wild, ecstatic sprint toward the goalkeeper. He dropped to the center circle entirely alone, burying his face in the grass, sobbing uncontrollably. The tears that had once defined his vulnerable childhood in Madeira had returned at the absolute peak of European glory. He had claimed his first Champions League crown, a victory that would inevitably secure his very first Ballon d'Or trophy and announce him to the universe as an unsolvable problem. Yet inside the celebratory locker room in Moscow, amidst the champagne and the gold medals, a quiet, monumental shift was already taking place behind the scenes. Ronaldo had conquered England, but his eyes were already turning toward a different, more glamorous white jersey, initiating a transfer war that would shatter the global financial structure of the sport and set up a historic confrontation in Spain that would trigger the greatest individual rivalry the world had ever seen. The hot summer of 2009 did not just witness a standard player transfer, it experienced a fundamental seismic shift that permanently rearranged the financial and competitive tectonic plates of global football. On July 6, 2009, 80,000 human beings packed themselves into the steep tiers of the Santiago Bernabéu Stadium in Madrid. They had not gathered to watch a football match, nor had they come to see a trophy presentation. They had assembled simply to witness a 24-year-old Cristiano Ronaldo walk out of a concrete tunnel wearing a pristine, blank white jersey. The atmosphere was thick with a brand of theatrical hysteria that the sport had never before generated for a single individual. Real Madrid had shattered the global transfer market structure by paying an unprecedented, history-making sum of £80 million to Manchester United in a single, cold transaction. As Ronaldo stepped onto the stage built in the center of the pitch, looked up at the sea of white flags, and executed his first celebratory shout of Hala Madrid, the entire universe realized that the sport was entering a hyper-commercialized dimension. He was no longer just a highly successful player operating within a traditional sporting system. He had transitioned into the ultimate Galactico, a walking financial enterprise corporate asset tasked with single-handedly breaking the domestic dominance of a legendary Barcelona dynasty. But behind the historic glamour of that presentation lay an incredibly heavy, pressure-cooked reality that would have completely crushed an ordinary athlete's psyche. Ronaldo was not walking into a stable, smoothly running team. He was being dropped into an institutional crisis. Real Madrid had spent years watching their bitter rivals Barcelona construct what many experts considered the most perfect, beautiful tic-tac machine in the history of the game, led by a quiet Argentine genius named Lionel Messi. The media did not look at Ronaldo's arrival as a standard sporting reinforcement. They immediately framed it as a brutal, zero-sum war for global cultural supremacy. Every single pass he made, every shot he took, and every individual gesture on the pitch was instantly compared to Messi's clinical artistry. The financial contrast was constantly weaponized by his critics. They argued that no single human being could ever be worth an £80 million investment, treating his immense price tag as a psychological target. For a boy who had learned how to fight in the dark rooms of Lisbon and Funchal, this manufactured hostility was not a deterrent. It was the exact type of fuel his obsessive psychology required to sustain its operational drive. The early years in the Spanish capital were defined by this brutal, high-velocity recalibration. Ronaldo had to adapt to a league that prioritized technical elegance and patient positional possession over the raw, transitional power of the Premier League. In his first season, despite scoring a spectacular 33 goals, Real Madrid finished second, watching Barcelona claim the domestic crown. The critics immediately sharpened their knives, claiming that Ronaldo's individualistic focus was fundamentally incompatible with winning trophies in Spain. They claimed his ego was a destructive element inside the locker room, and that he would always remain secondary to the collective harmony of Barcelona's golden generation. But those critics were making a fatal miscalculation regarding Ronaldo's internal constitution. He did not look for a compromise, he looked for total tic-tac evolution. He spent his afternoons at the Valdebebas training ground refining his finishing metrics, turning his body into a biological machine capable of scoring 40, 50, and 60 goals a year with mechanical predictability. He was deliberately engineering a version of himself that did not require the approval of the public, only the clinical validation of the scoresheet. By the time the iconic manager Jose Mourinho arrived in Madrid in 2010, the blueprint for the greatest individual rivalry in sports history was completely locked into place. The El Clasico matches were no longer standard football games. They were intense tactical wars that drew the eyes of hundreds of millions of people across the globe, entirely anchored by the terrifying goal-scoring volume of Ronaldo and Messi. Ronaldo had elevated his output to an autonomous level, converting his wide-winger role into a roaming, direct scoring entity that devastated defensive blocks through sheer physical and spatial dominance. He was matching Barcelona's poetic system with a display of raw power, verticality, and precision that looked entirely artificial on the tactical tape. He had successfully taken the immense weight of most expensive transfer in history and used it to fortify his own legacy. But this domestic warfare in Spain was merely the foundation for a much grander, more historical campaign of destruction, because the true, definitive arena where this monster would achieve immortal status was waiting for him under the starry nights of the European elite, where a historic obsession would eventually turn him into a clinical champion. The Champions League anthem is a composition that many elite footballers listen to with a sense of profound respect, but for Cristiano Ronaldo, it became a personal biological cue, a direct signal to initiate a level of athletic destruction that the modern game had never witnessed from a single human being. If his arrival in the Spanish capital as the ultimate Galactico was an exhibition of unprecedented financial power, the period between 2013 and 2018 inside the historic white shirt of Real Madrid was a clinical display of absolute, evolutionary supremacy. Football had spent over a century establishing tic-tac defensive systems designed to isolate and nullify individual attackers, but Ronaldo systematically dismantled those defensive metrics by transforming himself from a dynamic, touchline winger into a hyper-efficient, cold-blooded final third executioner. He was no longer running for the mere aesthetic pleasure of a step over. He was operating on a level of pure vertical optimization. Every single run into the penalty box was executed with a level of spatial precision that made world-class center backs look entirely stationary on the pitch. The numbers generated during this historic era shifted the conversations away from simple domestic rivalries and pushed his legacy directly into the territory of immortal basketball-like domination, becoming the first human being to score over 100 goals in the single history of the Champions League, recording 3 consecutive European titles, and turning the toughest tournament on Earth into his own automated goal factory. Every deep, data-driven archive tracking his performance reveal a cognitive transformation that bordered on the terrifying. Defenders weren't just struggling to keep pace with his physical sprint speed, which still hovered around 20 miles per hour even as he entered his 30s. They were entirely overwhelmed by his movement patterns without the ball. Ronaldo had unlocked the elite science of the blind side run, a split-second movement where he would position himself directly behind a defender's shoulder, waiting for the exact microsecond they turned their head to look at the ball, before exploding into the vacated space like a ghost. This was the era of the absolute physical monster. He was producing statistical seasons that felt entirely artificial, shattering the 40, 50, and 60-goal plateaus with a level of mechanical regularity that left his global critics completely silenced. The apex of this evolutionary cycle occurred on a historic European night in Turin in April 2018 against Juventus, inside a stadium filled with some of the most tactically defensive minds in the sport. As a high, looping cross from Dani Carvajal drifted slightly behind his linear path, Ronaldo launched his body into the air, connecting with the ball at an astronomical height of over 7 feet from the turf to execute a flawless, gravity-defying bicycle kick that left Gianluigi Buffon completely frozen on the goal line. It was a goal so pure, so detached from normal human capability, that the rival Italian supporters didn't boo. They stood up and delivered a thunderous, emotional standing ovation to a predator who had conquered their fortress. Yet behind the glitz of those history-making Champions League nights and his continuous harvest of individual awards, an internal friction was beginning to compromise the structural integrity of his relationship with the club's administration. Ronaldo did not look at his continuous stream of goals as a luxury. He viewed it as a baseline metric of investment that required absolute institutional validation. He demanded to be treated not just as a highly successful corporate employee, but as the single emotional and competitive anchor of the entire Real Madrid enterprise. When the club's leadership began to hesitate during complex, high-stakes contract renewals, treating his advancing age as a variable on a financial spreadsheet rather than a guarantee of eternal production, Ronaldo's immense ego felt a deep, institutional insult. He had given the club 4 European Cups, scored 450 goals in just 438 games, and turned their historic brand into the most feared football dynasty of the 21st century. But he realized they were preparing to look at a future that didn't completely revolve around his singular ambition. The celebrations of his 4th Champions League title in Kiev in May 2018 were not a shared moment of absolute communal joy. They were a public manifestation of a cold, calculated departure. Moments after lifting the historic trophy once again, while his teammates were still drenched in sweat and celebrating on the green grass, Ronaldo stood before the international microphones and spoke of his time in Madrid in the past tense, triggering a global financial and media firestorm that completely overshadowed the club's achievement. He had decided that his historic era in Spain had reached its absolute limit, and he was ready to pack his obsessive psychology into a brand new suitcase to conquer an entirely different, highly defensive league that had spent its entire history testing the physical limits of elite forwards. But as the global transfer networks scrambled to finalize a shocking €100 million transaction that would completely stun the European hierarchy, nobody could have predicted that this massive challenge in a foreign land would initiate the first quiet fractures in his biological armor, setting up a psychological threshold that would eventually push him toward the edge of an emotional crisis. The heavy texture of an international jersey carries a physical and psychological weight that can completely paralyze even the most accomplished club mercenaries, but for Cristiano Ronaldo, the red and green colors of Portugal were not a mere seasonal obligation. They were a lifelong internal ledger of unfulfilled duty. While his club career in Manchester and Madrid had established a continuous machinery of golden trophies and historical financial metrics, his relationship with his homeland remained an open, bleeding wound. For over a decade, the international media had weaponized a highly frustrating narrative. They claimed that Ronaldo was a corporate entity who only achieved peak optimization when surrounded by the elite, systemic wealth of Real Madrid. While turning into an isolated, ineffective icon the moment he stepped onto the pitch for a nation that had never won a major international trophy. They constantly reminded him of the devastating trauma of 2004, where an 18-year-old Ronaldo had wept bitterly on the pitch of Lisbon after losing the European final to Greece. That childhood heartbreak had become the foundational anchor of his international identity, a psychological debt that he carried on his shoulders through every single World Cup and European campaign, knowing that true immortality in the eyes of his people could never be purchased with club medals alone. When the summer of 2016 arrived, the internal pressure inside the Portuguese camp had reached an absolute boiling point. Portugal traveled to the European Championship in France with a squad that sports analysts consider deeply flawed, a highly defensive transition group that lacked the fluid attacking harmony of Germany or the tactical refinement of Spain. From the opening matches of the group stage, the tournament looked like it was engineered to become Ronaldo's ultimate public humiliation. The team struggled to find a single victory, stumbling through 3 consecutive frustrating draws against Iceland, Austria, and Hungary. The global press sharpened their knives, focusing their lenses on a missed penalty against Austria and an explosive media incident where a frustrated Ronaldo threw a reporter's microphone into a lake. The entire world was waiting for the physical machine to fracture under the weight of an entire country's anxiety. But it was precisely within this environment of absolute systemic chaos that Ronaldo's leadership mutated into an unyielding, psychological force. Against Hungary, in a chaotic match where Portugal faced immediate elimination 3 separate times, he single-handedly dragged his team back from the dead, scoring 2 spectacular, high-velocity goals to salvage a 3-3 draw and secure a desperate path into the knockout rounds through the narrow back door of the third-place sorting pool. As Portugal scraped and fought their way through the knockout matrix, bypassing Croatia, Poland, and Wales through a display of sheer defensive resilience and Ronaldo's timely physical interventions, the universe was preparing the ultimate cinematic climax inside the Stade de France in Paris. On July 10, 2016, Portugal walked out to face the host nation, France, a team filled with supreme athletic confidence and backed by a partisan stadium of 80,000 screaming fans. It was the exact historical redemption arc Ronaldo had spent 12 years waiting to execute. But football is an inherently cruel theater, and destiny handles its scripts with a complete lack of sentimentality. In the 8th minute of the match, a brutal, heavy challenge from Dimitri Payet locked into Ronaldo's knee, hyperextending the joint and tearing the internal ligaments. The physical machine that had spent a decade resisting the wear and tear of elite football was suddenly broken. Ronaldo attempted to play through the blinding physical agony twice, wrapping his leg in heavy medical tape, but by the 24th minute, his body completely collapsed onto the grass. As tears of pure, unadulterated devastation streamed down his face, a solitary moth landed directly on his eyelash, a haunting, surreal image captured by global television broadcasts that symbolized the tragic fall of a king on the brink of his greatest achievement. Yet, what unfolded over the next 90 minutes was the definitive proof that Ronaldo's impact on football could no longer be calculated through simple physical actions on a spreadsheet. He refused to disappear into the medical training rooms. Instead, he returned to the touchline with his leg heavily immobilized, transforming himself into a frantic, hyper-emotional extension of manager Fernando Santos. He spent the remainder of extra time limping up and down the technical area, shouting tactical instructions, physically pushing his teammates into position, and breathing his own fanatical self-belief into a group of exhausted players. When a substitute forward named Eder prepared to step onto the pitch, Ronaldo grabbed him by the shoulders and told him with absolute, clinical certainty that he would score the winning goal. In the 109th minute, when Eder unleashed a low, thunderous strike into the corner of the French net, the stadium experienced an institutional shock. The final whistle didn't just announce Portugal as the champions of Europe. It completely re-engineered Ronaldo's global legacy. He had finally lifted his country to their very first international crown, carrying the weight of a nation on his back even when his legs could no longer sprint. But as the historic celebrations in Lisbon began to fade into the winter of 2018, this ultimate international validation would trigger a deep, existential realization inside his mind, forcing him to conclude that his historic cycle in Spain had reached its absolute end, setting up a shocking financial transaction that would completely stun the traditional European hierarchy. The summer of 2018 did not just witness a massive marquee transfer. It executed an institutional and financial shockwave that completely rewrote the traditional economic playbook of European football. When Cristiano Ronaldo decided to finalize his departure from Real Madrid after conquering his fourth Champions League title in Kiev, he didn't look for a comfortable, low-stakes environment to begin the natural twilight of his career. He looked at a map of Europe and selected the most tactically rigid, defensively unforgiving environment on the continent, Italy's Serie A. Juventus, a historic giant that had completely dominated domestic Italian football for 7 consecutive seasons, was facing its own deep, existential crisis. They could win the Scudetto with mechanical predictability, but the ultimate European prize, the Champions League, remained an agonizingly unreachable mirage. The club's board realized that to cross that final competitive threshold, they needed more than a tactical system. They needed an absolute cheat code. They engineered a financial blueprint that seemed completely insane for a 33-year-old athlete, a €100 million transfer fee combined with an astronomical annual net salary of €31 million. It was a staggering commercial gamble that corporate spreadsheets could barely justify, but the moment Ronaldo arrived in Turin, the traditional financial metrics were shattered. Within 24 hours of his medical announcement, Juventus sold over 500,000 official jerseys, their corporate stock on the Milan exchange surged by over 30%, and the entire Italian football matrix experienced an unprecedented influx of global media attention. But behind the spectacular commercial theater lay a brutal, physical laboratory that would challenge the absolute limits of Ronaldo's biological engineering. Serie A was not the open, transitional landscape of the Premier League or the tactical showcase of La Liga. It was an arena built on defensive patience, compact low blocks, and veteran center-backs who treated space as a sacred resource. In his opening matches for Juventus, the machine seemed to stall. The open spaces he had routinely exploited in Spain were completely choked out by packed defensive lines that refused to bite on his kinetic baits. The Italian media, inherently analytical and quick to doubt outside intervention, began to ask the ultimate question: had the physical deterioration finally caught up with the monster? But those who questioned his adaptive capability were ignoring the fanatical psychological blueprint he had carried since his dark rooms in Lisbon. Ronaldo systematically recalibrated his spatial movement, trading his high-velocity sprints for hyper-efficient positioning inside the penalty box. He adjusted to the slower, more deliberate tempo of Italian football, converting himself into an elite target man who used his upper body mass to pin defenders before unleashing a clinical strike. By the conclusion of his opening season, the doubts had vanished into the mountain air as he fired Juventus to yet another domestic title, proving that his goal-scoring volume could automate success in any footballing culture. Yet the true parameter of his investment was never going to be measured by domestic trophies. The spreadsheet in Turin was exclusively built for the Starry Nights of the Champions League. The defining manifesto of this Italian challenge occurred in March 2019 during a high-pressure round of 16-second leg against Atletico Madrid. Juventus had suffered a devastating 2-0 defeat in the first leg in Madrid, a tic-tac failure that left them on the absolute brink of European elimination. The global media had already written the obituary of Ronaldo's European dominance. But on that night in Turin, Ronaldo didn't just play a football match, he single-handedly bent a Champions League tie to his absolute will. He produced a display of raw, dictatorial supremacy, scoring a historic hat-trick against Diego Simeone's famously indestructible defensive unit. He unlocked the game with 2 thunderous, gravity-defying headers, rising above giant defenders with a level of vertical suspension that looked completely artificial, before clinically burying a maximum pressure penalty in the final minutes to complete an impossible 3-0 comeback. The stadium erupted into an emotional frenzy, realizing that this was exactly why they had compromised their institutional wage structure to sign the 33-year-old predator. However, a single spectacular night cannot permanently mask the deeper, structural cracks that were beginning to form inside the Juventus enterprise. While Ronaldo continued to maintain his high goal-scoring volume, eventually reaching over 100 goals in just 131 appearances for the club, the collective team around him was quietly deteriorating. The massive financial gravity of his €31 million salary prevented the club from successfully rebuilding an aging midfield and reinforcing a fragile defensive line. Juventus began to suffer shocking, highly frustrating European eliminations against younger, highly dynamic teams like Ajax, Lyon, and Porto. Ronaldo found himself increasingly isolated on the pitch, a clinical finisher stranded inside an uninspired system that lacked the creative wealth of his former surroundings in Madrid. He had conquered Italy, claiming 2 Serie A titles and a top scorer award, but the ultimate European fairy tale he had promised to deliver to Turin was completely unraveling. As the hot summer of 2021 approached, a deep sense of competitive claustrophobia began to settle over his obsessive mind, forcing him to conclude that his Italian ledger was full and triggering a desperate, midnight desire to execute one final, emotional return to the place where his global legend had originally been engineered, unaware that this nostalgic homecoming would trap him inside the most toxic, volatile relationship of his professional life. The concept of a nostalgic homecoming inside the theater of sport is designed to generate immediate, poetic applause, but for Cristiano Ronaldo, re-entering the red corridors of Old Trafford in August 2021 mutated into the most toxic, volatile, and psychologically punishing chapter of his entire professional existence. The global football landscape experienced an absolute financial and emotional frenzy when Manchester United announced that the prodigal son was officially returning to England. The commercial spreadsheets warped instantly. Fans flooded the digital stores, breaking global sales records within a single 12-hour window, and the theater of dreams prepared itself for a grand resurrection. On his second debut against Newcastle United, the script looked completely flawless. Ronaldo scored 2 spectacular goals, driving a packed stadium into a state of pure communal euphoria, proving that his predatory final third instincts remained perfectly optimized. He finished that exhausting individual campaign with an impressive 24 goals across all competitions, single-handedly rescuing a structurally fragmented team from complete domestic collapse. But beneath the surface of those dramatic, late-minute winners, a profound generational and institutional friction was quietly choking out the club's structural identity, transforming his grand return into an arena of total isolation. As the hot summer of 2022 approached, the competitive framework around him suffered a devastating, heartbreaking shift that no amount of athletic conditioning could ever fix. Away from the tactical scrutiny of the pitch, Ronaldo and his partner experienced a profound personal tragedy with the heartbreaking loss of their newborn son during childbirth. It was a shattering emotional blow that broke through his legendary psychological armor, exposing the vulnerable human being behind the engineered machine. He required time, privacy, and deep institutional empathy to navigate a level of grief that made football analytics look completely meaningless. But the high-stakes machine of the Premier League moves with a complete lack of sentimentality. When he missed the club's critical preseason tour due to these deeply traumatic family circumstances, the incoming corporate hierarchy did not see a grieving father. They saw an aging, highly expensive employee who was failing to meet his operational parameters. A new manager, Erik ten Hag, arrived with a rigid, tactical blueprint built on total collective compliance, high-pressing metrics, and an absolute refusal to let the entire club revolve around the singular ambition of a 37-year-old icon. The relationship between the fanatical Portuguese superstar and the authoritarian Dutch manager collapsed with mechanical predictability. Ten Hag systematically reduced Ronaldo's operational status, dropping him to the substitution bench and treating his historic presence as a late-game tactical variable rather than an absolute guarantee of success. For a man who had spent 2 decades breaking every goal-scoring record in European history, being told to warm up for the final 2 minutes of a match was treated as a profound, calculated institutional insult. The tension reached an absolute breaking point during a volatile match against Tottenham, where a visibly furious Ronaldo refused to step onto the pitch as a late substitute, walking directly down the tunnel before the final whistle had even blown. The media launched an immediate campaign of intense scrutiny, claiming that his massive ego had officially become a destructive, unmanageable element inside the locker room. Ronaldo realized that the institution he had helped turn into a global empire was actively trying to erase his legacy, forcing him to take a desperate, nuclear option to regain total control over his own narrative. In November 2022, on the absolute eve of the Winter World Cup, Ronaldo sat down for an explosive, no-holds-barred television interview that effectively burned his remaining bridges to English football to absolute ash. He openly declared that he felt completely betrayed by the club's administration, stated plainly that he possessed absolutely zero respect for Erik ten Hag, and criticized the institution for failing to evolve its training infrastructure since his initial departure in 2009. The institutional shockwave was immediate. Within days, Manchester United formally terminated his multi-million-pound contract by mutual consent, leaving the greatest goal scorer on earth completely homeless, stripped of his club identity, and heading into his final World Cup as an isolated free agent. His performance in Qatar became a tragic extension of this domestic crisis, as he was dropped to the bench by his national team, eventually walking off the pitch in tears after a crushing elimination. The European elite looked at his advancing age, his massive financial requirements, and his volatile media presence, and collectively closed their doors, forcing him to realize that his historic era on the continent was completely finished, setting up a mind-boggling transaction in an unfamiliar land that would permanently alter the geopolitical paradigm of the beautiful game. When the cold winter of 2022 began to freeze the traditional power dynamics of European football, the elite boardrooms of London, Paris, and Munich were operating under a shared, unwritten consensus. They believed that a 37-year-old Cristiano Ronaldo was a spent corporate asset, a magnificent historical monument whose volatile media presence and massive financial gravity made him entirely incompatible with the high-intensity tactical setups of the modern European game. After his multi-million-pound contract with Manchester United was violently terminated by mutual consent following a nuclear television interview, Ronaldo found himself stranded in a state of absolute, unprecedented isolation. For the first time in his 20-year career, the phone inside his agent's office simply stopped ringing with premium offers from the Champions League hierarchy. The sports spreadsheets were completely closed to him, treating his advancing biological age as an irreversible limitation on a balance sheet. But those who believed that this isolation would force a quiet, dignified retirement into the shadows of the sport were failing to calculate the sheer scale of his internal engine. Ronaldo did not look at the closed doors of Europe and see a dead end. He looked at the global map of the sport and decided to execute the single most daring geopolitical calculation in the history of the beautiful game, launching a financial and cultural paradigm shift that would permanently move the axis of footballing wealth toward an entirely new continent. On December 30th, 2022, the sports universe experienced an absolute institutional shock when a historic Saudi Arabian club named Al Nassr officially announced the signature of Cristiano Ronaldo. The financial figures tied to the transaction did not just shatter the traditional wage structures of the sport, they completely warped the economic reality of global entertainment, establishing a staggering contract worth an unprecedented €200 million per season. It was a mind-boggling deployment of sovereign wealth that standard football clubs operating under European financial regulations could barely comprehend, converting a 37-year-old striker into the most highly compensated athlete on the face of the planet. But this move was infinitely larger than a massive, luxury paycheck at the end of a legendary career. Ronaldo was not traveling to the desert to slide quietly into an easy, low-intensity holiday league. He was arriving as the absolute spearhead of a massive, state-backed cultural blueprint designed to fundamentally re-engineer the geopolitical hierarchy of international sport. The moment he held up the yellow and blue jersey with his iconic number 7, the traditional boundaries of the sport were shattered, causing millions of young fans across the globe to instantly download Al Nassr tracking parameters and setting up a monumental structural transformation that would completely change how elite clubs approach their recruitment strategies. The transition to Riyadh, however, was accompanied by an immense wave of public skepticism and intense media mockery from traditionalists who viewed his move as a tragic, money-driven exile into sporting irrelevance. Critics claimed that by leaving the European theater behind, Ronaldo had officially surrendered his place in a historical hierarchy, choosing economic luxury over true competitive dignity. But the moment his biological machine stepped onto the pitch in Saudi Arabia, the fanatical perfectionist inside his psychology took total control of the environment. Ronaldo did not treat the Saudi Pro League as a retirement home. He treated every single fixture with the exact same fanatical intensity he had displayed under the rainy skies of Manchester and inside the packed stadiums of Madrid. He systematically adapted his predatory instincts to the intense heat and different tactical tempos of the region, restructuring his spatial movements to serve as a clinical, cold-blooded focal point for Al Nassr's offensive machine. The statistics quickly automated his relevance once again as he generated a spectacular, history-making campaign, scoring over 50 goals in a single calendar year to finish as the world's top scorer, completely silencing those who believed his biological metrics had deteriorated beyond recovery. Yet the true legacy of this Eastern challenge was not going to be measured exclusively by his continuous stream of goals or his clinical dominance inside the penalty box. Ronaldo's presence acted as a massive gravitational magnet that completely destabilized the traditional European transfer monopoly. Within months of his arrival, His revolutionary move cleared a bold path for a staggering migration of elite footballing wealth, convincing established champions, league winners, and prime international stars to abandon the historic capitals of Europe and board flights to Riyadh. The footballing ecosystem was witnessing a massive multi-billion-dollar paradigm shift where age, prestige, and financial structures were being completely redefined by a new economic superpower. Ronaldo had successfully taken the heavy weight of a global exile and used it to engineer a brand new empire, turning an unfamiliar land into the absolute center of a modern footballing revolution. But as his body continued to defy the traditional boundaries of time, registering numbers that looked entirely artificial for a 40-year-old athlete, a much grander, more emotional countdown was quietly beginning to echo behind the scenes as the final pages of his immortal blueprint were waiting to be written under the lens of universal history, leading toward an inevitable, monumental sunset that would test the absolute threshold of his legacy. To look at the complete architectural structure of Cristiano Ronaldo's career is to realize that we are no longer evaluating a traditional sportsman, but an absolute milestone that completely redefined the biological, structural, and financial parameters of the beautiful game. When you strip away the temporary noise of social media arguments, tactical debates, and volatile transfer sagas, what remains is an immovable mountain of cold, clinical data that looks entirely artificial on a spreadsheet. We are talking about a kid who left an isolated tin-roofed house in the mountainside neighborhood of Funchal with nothing but a scrawny frame and a heavy island accent, and who systematically went on to record over 900 official goals in professional football. This number is not just a personal achievement, it is a historical shock to the system, an elite milestone that multiple generations of prime forwards will spend their entire lives chasing in vain. He won 5 UEFA Champions League crowns, lifted 5 Ballon d'Or trophies, and claimed domestic league titles across England, Spain, and Italy, automating success in every single footballing culture he touched. He took the heavy, psychological burden of legendary jerseys and used that intense pressure to build an unbreakable physical armor, converting his trauma into raw kinetic force that sustained its operational drive for more than 2 decades at the absolute peak of human engineering. But the true significance of Cristiano Ronaldo can never be fully calculated by listing his trophies or counting his goals on a screen. His real legacy is found in the complete mental calibration he forced upon the sport. Before Ronaldo, football viewed natural talent as an uncontrollable, poetic gift that faded naturally with time. He proved to the universe that greatness could be systematically engineered, automated, and prolonged through an obsessive commitment to human optimization. He transformed the daily routine of a professional footballer into a clinical process, turning his own body into a perfect laboratory of conditioning where every meal, every hour of sleep, and every training session was measured down to the millimeter. He taught an entire generation of athletes that the ultimate revenge against public hatred, systemic doubt, and professional isolation was not silence, but absolute, uncompromising on-pitch dominance. He carried the massive financial gravity of record-breaking transfers and the profound anxiety of an entire nation on his back, and he never allowed the immense weight to slow down his horizontal acceleration or drop his vertical suspension in the air. He was a human predator who treated every single match, from a low-stakes preseason exhibition in Lisbon to a freezing, maximum-pressure Champions League final in Moscow, with the exact same fanatical desire to possess the game entirely. Now, as the legendary clock quietly ticks toward the final sunset of his historic journey, his immortal blueprint remains permanently etched into the fabric of global sport. He did not just break records, he changed the geopolitical paradigm of the game, proving that a singular icon possessed enough gravitational mass to pull the financial axis of the sport toward entirely new horizons. Cristiano Ronaldo dos Santos Aveiro remains the definitive monument of pure self-belief, a human mechanism that looked at extreme scarcity and designed a path to absolute immortality. He showed us that every legend has a story the highlights never show, a story built in the cold darkness of empty gyms at 2 a.m., born out of tears of frustration, and sustained by an unyielding obsession to become the greatest entity to ever touch a football. His numbers will remain in Okankavase, standing as a silent, towering challenge to anyone who dares to dream of excellence, a permanent reminder that the beautiful game was once completely conquered by a kid from Madeira who simply refused to accept mediocrity. If you want to truly understand the deep, dramatic stories, the massive money, and the structural forces that define the beautiful game, don't let this journey end here. Subscribe to the Football Archive right now, leave a like on this video, and turn on your notifications so you never miss our deep dive documentaries into the tactical blueprints, the shocking rises, and the epic falls of the icons who changed football history forever. Tell us in the comments below, what does Cristiano Ronaldo's legacy mean to you, and who is the next global icon whose complete story you want us to uncover in the dark rooms of the archive?